you so much. It's a great honor to be back at the Webb School. I was part of what was known as the Ancient Guard. I was here from 7th grade through 12th grade, member of the Honor Council, and I really enjoyed getting to meet several of you through the day. And I want to talk about what I believe to be the most important part of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, and that's the First Amendment. The First Amendment represents our blueprint for personal liberty. It's the matrix. It's the indispensable element of the Constitution that gives meaning to all the other freedoms and individual liberties that we have. Now, the First Amendment reads, "Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances." So it's the First Amendment that gives us the right to speak out and criticize government officials. It gives us the right to practice whatever religious faith we want, or none at all. It gives us the right to write about different issues in newspapers, blogs, etc. It gives us the right to engage in marches and public demonstrations in a peaceful manner. And it gives us the right to petition government officials asking for redress of grievances. Now, we know that the First Amendment applies when we engage in speech, correct? So if we utter words and then are punished by the government, that's free speech. We know that printed words in a book or a newspaper are also speech or expression within the meaning of the First Amendment. The first fundamental First Amendment principle that I want to convey to you, however, is that the First Amendment encompasses much more than the spoken word or the printed word. It encompasses various forms of so-called expressive conduct, or what we know as symbolic speech. And so on February 24th of 1969, the United States Supreme Court famously wrote that it can hardly be argued that either public school teachers or students shed their constitutional rights at the schoolhouse gate. That public school students had the right to wear black peace armbands to protest the Vietnam War. In other words, the act of wearing the black armband was a form of speech. Now, what we also know, however, is that sit-ins, right? Sit-ins were an essential protest element of the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s. We see a modern iteration of this when football players kneel when the national anthem is being played. Whatever one thinks of that, whether they view it as disrespecting the flag or the anthem or a form of free speech, it is a form of free speech. By kneeling, that's a form of protest. And if it involves government action, then they have free speech rights. So, for example, in public school, students have First Amendment rights because the United States Supreme Court has said so. The First Amendment protects us when the government infringes on our free speech rights. In a private school, right, private school is not the government. A private school can tell you what to do, and you don't have a First Amendment right in private school, unless the school chooses to recognize those principles. More controversially, in 1989, in a case called Texas versus Johnson, the United States Supreme Court ruled by a single vote that Gregory Lee Johnson had a First Amendment right to burn the American flag as a form of political protest. Writing for the Supreme Court, Justice William Brennan wrote, quote, "If there is a bedrock principle underlying the First Amendment, it's that the government may not prohibit the expression of an idea simply because society finds it offensive or disagreeable." You know, one thing in the First Amendment world is that the First Amendment often gets judged by the shabby contemporary company that it keeps. So you hear about the First Amendment protecting the flag burner. the disseminator of hate speech, somebody who advertises tobacco products. I want you to always keep in mind that the First Amendment has also been an essential tool for social progress. The women's suffragists of the 19-teens used their First Amendment rights to protest their second-class treatment in American society, which eventually led to the adoption of the 19th Amendment, giving women the right to vote in 1919, with Tennessee, I believe, becoming the necessary state for ratification of that important amendment. The First Amendment was also essential to the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s. John Lewis said that the civil rights movement without the First Amendment would have been a bird without wings. So if you read about the First Amendment issues in Shelbyville, Tennessee, let's say, in the upcoming months, and you see that a lot of the people are engaging in speech that we don't like, just remember the First Amendment protects the speech of those that we don't like, or speech that we don't like, but it also protects the speech that we support. Now, another fundamental First Amendment principle is that the text of the First Amendment seems to be absolutist in nature, right? Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech. On its face, that seems to me that the First Amendment protects everything. It doesn't, however. There have always been narrow, unprotected categories of speech that the First Amendment doesn't protect. So it's often said, well, why does the First Amendment oftentimes protect hate speech? Why in the world would there be protection for speech that protects such hateful venom? The idea is that we don't want the government censoring and silencing ideas. But it's also the case that sometimes the government can regulate hate speakers. Hate speech is not protected if it rises to the level of a true threat, if it incites imminent lawless action, or it represents fighting words. And an important element of First Amendment, the development of First Amendment law in American society, is that over time, what were once these vast, unprotected categories of speech have been narrowed. So, for example, years ago, there were obscenity prosecutions for booksellers who sold novels by D.H. Lawrence and James Joyce. That's no longer the case. Obscenity prosecutions are reserved for very, very bad, very violent sexual materials. Fighting words, defined by the U.S. Supreme Court as words which by their very utterance inflict injury or cause an immediate breach of the peace. That used to be applied to any speech that was critical of a government official. It's not the case anymore. It only applies to very narrow, face-to-face personal insults. Another fundamental First Amendment principle that I want you to come away with is the idea about content and viewpoint. We generally do not want the government making content-based and viewpoint-based discrimination against speech. The idea is that we should allow people to speak, and then if it's speech that we don't like, we counter it with positive speech. There's a famous justice on the U.S. Supreme Court, Justice Thurgood Marshall. As consistent a defender of the First Amendment as we've ever had. I recommend the movie Marshall, by the way, if you have time to see it. Now, when we think of Thurgood Marshall, we normally think of the great civil rights advocate who won 29 of the 32 cases that he argued before the U.S. Supreme Court. The first African American to ever serve on the United States Supreme Court. And in 1972, in a case called Police Department, the City of Chicago versus Mosley, he wrote, but above all else, the First Amendment means that the government may not restrict speech because of its message, its ideas, its subject matter, or its content. I tell my students that that's the miscellaneous quote, M-I-S-C. Now, in the real world, we know that doesn't happen. There's a dissonance between what I refer to as the real and the ideal. The ideal is that we protect speech. We have a healthy protection for free speech. The reality is much different. Oftentimes, those who blow the whistle on government corruption, those who speak out against government policies, those who criticize government officials, sometimes they're punished. It's an unfortunate reality. But that's why we have a legal system. That's why I hope that some of you will leave Webb School, go on to college, and then go on to law school. Because you can make a difference. You can make a difference in this society. This idea about letting all speech into the marketplace is traced all the way back to nearly 100 years ago to a guy by the name of Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, Jr. He served for many years in the Supreme Judicial Court of Massachusetts before being elevated to the U.S. Supreme Court. Wounded 3 or 4 times in the Civil War, fighting for the Union. And when he first got on the U.S. Supreme Court, he was not very protective of the First Amendment. He was always on the side of government restriction. And then he started thinking about it, he started reading. And he changed his mind. And in 1919, in a dissenting opinion, in a case called Abrams versus United States, he essentially wrote this quote. He wrote a lot of things, but part of it was this passage here that I really like, where he said, "The best test of truth is the power of the thought to get itself accepted into the competition of the market." It's very similar to what John Milton wrote in Areopagitica in 1644. "Let truth and falsehood grapple. Whoever knew truth put to the worse in a free and open encounter." The idea behind the First Amendment, again, is that we allow speech to flourish. We don't censor it. We don't silence it. We try to show why it's wrong. Now, Holmes had a colleague on the United States Supreme Court, the first man of the Jewish faith to ever serve on the U.S. Supreme Court, Louis Brandeis. And Louis Brandeis came up with one of the other foundational principles in our constitutional democracy, and it's called the counter-speech doctrine. In 1927, in a case called Whitney versus California, he wrote, quote, "If there be time to expose through discussion the falsehood and fallacies, to avert the evils by the processes of education, the remedy to be applied is more speech, not enforced silence." What does that mean? When we see hate speech out there, we don't immediately shut it down. We show why it's wrong. We counter it. That's the appropriate response in a constitutional democracy. To just immediately shut it down, that's the hallmark of an authoritarian, dare I say even totalitarian government. In a free society, we have to tolerate a lot of disputatious speech, a lot of expression that we don't like. Another fundamental First Amendment principle is that it protects a lot of speech, as I said, that we don't like. The Westboro Baptist Church may be the most pristine example of that. The Westboro Baptist Church was a church founded by a lawyer who's now deceased named Fred Phelps. At one time, he was a fairly well-respected civil rights lawyer. And then somewhere along the way, I think he lost his way. He started going around to the funerals of slain members of the military, holding up the most vile messages, saying essentially, God has punished us because the country advocates freedom for gays and lesbians. just vile anti-gay slurs. The United States Supreme Court ended up ruling in favor of Fred Phelps and his daughter Margie in a case called Snyder versus Phelps in 2011. Chief Justice John G. Roberts Jr. said, "Speech can cause great harm. It can bring us to both tears of joy and sorrow, but it can also inflict great pain. Now, we can react to that pain by silencing the speaker, but in this nation we have chosen a different course, to tolerate even the most obnoxious and repugnant speech in a free society. That's what we do." Of all the most important free speech cases, I sometimes get asked, what's the most important one? It's hard to pick out just one, but if I had to pick out just one, it might be New York Times Company versus Sullivan, 1964. It's the case in which the United States Supreme Court established constitutional limitations on libel laws. On March 29, 1960, the Committee to Defend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in the struggle to defend freedom in the South printed a 10-paragraph editorial advertisement in the New York Times where they talked about Southern violations of human rights. They talked about students on Alabama State College being padlocked in the dining hall, the campus ringed with tear gas, and various other Southern violators of human rights. Well, guess what? There were some errors in that article, particularly the 3rd and 6th paragraphs. The dining hall wasn't padlocked. The college campus wasn't ringing with tear gas. Dr. King had only been arrested 4 times instead of 7. So L.B. Sullivan, the city commissioner in charge of the police department, files a libel lawsuit in Alabama State Court against the New York Times, suing him for libel, making false statements of fact about him that harmed his reputation. And guess what? He got $500,000 from an all-white jury in an Alabama State Court. That case went all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court. At the time that case was being decided, there were at least 11 other libel lawsuits asking for more than $11 million against media entities that were reporting about abuses in the civil rights era. So this case not only established more protection for speech, but it also, in essence, according to author Anthony Lewis, it saved the civil rights movement. And one of the important passages is, we must consider this case against a profound national commitment that debate on public issues should be robust, uninhibited, and wide open. It may well include vehement, caustic, and sometimes unpleasantly sharp attacks upon public officials. This is the decision that protected the citizen critic, the one who thinks differently, the one who says, wait a minute, we need to speak out against what we view as government abuse. And you may say, well, wait a second, the New York Times made some mistakes. Shouldn't we be able to punish a newspaper when they're not 100% accurate? No, according to the U.S. Supreme Court. Error is inevitable in debate. Mistakes happen. We're only going to punish the press when they're writing about public officials, when they act knowing that something was false, or acting in reckless disregard because we must provide breathing space to First Amendment freedoms. The concept of breathing space is essential to understanding why free speech and freedom of the press is protected so much in this country. Now let's talk a little bit about threats to free speech. And we have a president who has been very vocal about changing the country's libel laws. When he says that, He's essentially saying we need to change Times v. Sullivan. I disagree. We have the right to disagree with any government official, including the president. Now, I can understand personally why you might criticize the press. They've sometimes been a little bit critical of him, have they not? But that doesn't mean we should reduce free speech protection for everybody. He's also said he would criminalize anyone from burning the flag. But what if somebody is burning the flag as a way to show certain injustices or to protest certain policies? The U.S. Supreme Court, as I said, in 1989, protected Gregory Lee Johnson's right to do so. There's a current case now brought by the Knight Institute of Columbia University. It's one, if you're at all interested about free speech, and I hope you are, watch this case closely. Because our president has really been very active on Twitter. Has he not? He's got millions upon millions of followers. Well, if you agree with him, you can follow his Twitter feed. But if you disagree with him and are very vocal about it, you get blocked. No more. Now, the key question for us is whether at Real Donald Trump, is that a public forum? Is that a form of state action? In other words, is the president engaging in impermissible viewpoint discrimination by silencing those who disagree with him? It's an interesting question. It's one we don't know the answer to yet. The lawsuit was just filed earlier this summer. There's also this issue about respect for the flag. Now, the NFL, the National Football League, is not a governmental actor. It's a private organization. So when the NFL tells an individual that they have to do something or they can't do something, they generally have the right to do that. They're not the government. And on June 14, 1943, Flag Day, by the way, the United States Supreme Court decided a case called West Virginia Board of Education versus Barnett. They ruled that public school students could not be expelled from school for refusing to salute the flag and recite the Pledge of Allegiance. It was a 6-3 decision. Justice Robert Jackson, writing for the Supreme Court, said, quote, "If there's any fixed star in our constitutional constellation, is that no official high or petty shall prescribe what should be orthodox in matters of politics, nationalism, or religion. That there is an individual sphere of liberty that the government cannot invade." That's the principle at stake with regard to when individuals kneel or refuse to show respect for the flag or the pledge. Another threat to the First Amendment that I see is the fate of public employees in this country. There are, by anywhere accounts, anywhere from 22 million to 31 million public employees in the United States. That means they work for an agency of the local government, state government, or the federal government. And traditionally, if a public employee speaks out on a matter of public importance, something that's important to the community at large, then we balance that public employee's right to speak against the government's interest in an efficient, disruptive, free workplace. So, for example, let's say that a public school teacher says that there's mold in her classroom. She notices there's mold. That's unsanitary. That's not healthy for her kids. And she complains about it to her principal. And nothing's done. She speaks out again. Eventually, Whoa, her contract's not renewed. She's let go. She says, well, I have been retaliated against because I would not let the safety issue go. Another example is a police officer in Illinois who felt that certain criminals were getting away and escaping custody because there was a leak. Somebody was leaking information to these criminals. So the police officer goes to his boss and says, well, we got a leak, we got a problem. He's demoted for speaking out. Now, it used to be the case that these employees may be protected, right? And there's certain value in that, right? We want public school teachers to speak out about unsanitary conditions. We want law enforcement officials to be able to speak out about corruption. But in 2006, our United States Supreme Court created a categorical rule in a case called Garcetti versus Ceballos. I view it as one of the worst decisions decided by the U.S. Supreme Court in modern memory. And the Supreme Court wrote in 2006, they said, when public employees make statements pursuant to their official job duties, the Constitution does not insulate them from discipline, and they have no First Amendment free speech rights. No First Amendment protection for the whistleblower who speaks out about unsafe, unsanitary conditions. No First Amendment protection from the firefighter who said we're having trouble fighting fires because we don't have enough manpower. That's a very troubling decision to me. This notion of no free speech protection at all for anything that's described as official speech. For a teacher, that could apply to any classroom speech. That's terrible. That's a threat to free speech that we're currently dealing with today. Mass governmental surveillance. I was actually asked this question by a student in a class of 5 students. That's one thing I hope you appreciate about the Webb School is class size. I teach a class at Vanderbilt Law School. I've got 123 students. I don't think they learned as well as those 5 that I saw in that wonderful government teacher's class. You got everybody engaging in dialogue. It's beautiful to see. Warmed my heart. And the question I was asked was about mass governmental surveillance. Is that a First Amendment issue? Yes, it is. Because if you know you are being watched, you are going to watch what you say. It's what's referred to as a chilling effect on speech or a freezing effect on speech. And my response in class was, well, when the government surveils us, it may present more of a Fourth Amendment issue. Fourth Amendment is the amendment that protects us from unreasonable searches and seizures by the government. But the point I want to stress to you today is that it also presents a First Amendment issue. Why? Because if we know we're being watched, we're going to check what we say. Now, sometimes in society, right, we need to check what we say. The price of free speech can often be quite high. With rights come responsibilities. I'll be the first to acknowledge that. And I would support that. Don't post anything on your social media account. It can come back to haunt you. Right? It's just common sense. Now, I go around and speak at a lot of public universities and colleges. I was just at Kent State 2 weeks ago. Last week I was at Howard Law School. And there's a lot of controversial free speech issues occurring on our college and university campuses. Speakers are being disinvited. People are shouting down public speakers. Glad nobody's doing that to me. Pretty loud though, but there's a lot of issues going on our public college and university campuses, and some of it is certainly well-intentioned. Right? We don't want to hear from this guy who's the right-wing provocateur. But remember, the First Amendment rights, and First Amendment rights are indivisible. They protect all of us. And under the First Amendment, there is not a right not to be offended. We have to be able to deal with uncomfortable ideas. Now, there's a difference between harassment and cyberbullying. That's wrong. And there are some well-drafted cyberbullying laws and policies out there. As a matter of human decency, you should never bully another human being. It's despicable. But in general free society, adults in free society, there is not a right not to be offended. The late Nat Hentoff once referred to it as free speech for me, but not for thee. That in theory, yes, I support free speech, but I don't support that group of speakers. I don't support that group of speakers. You start taking out different slices of the pie, what's left? Only the speech that is the most sterile, the most boring. Justice Felix Frankfurter expressed this concept, albeit in a non-First Amendment case, in a dissenting opinion in the United States versus Rabinowitz years ago. He said, quote, "Many of our most important constitutional freedoms have been forged in controversies involving not very nice people." Right? It's often people on the fringes who push the envelope, who bring forth controversies that result in these cases. Now there's one other threat to speech that I want to talk about. It's called the government speech doctrine. Remember I said the most fundamental of all free speech principles is that generally the government may not discriminate against speakers based on their viewpoint. Like those kids who wore the black protest armbands, they were punished, while the kids who wore iron crosses and political campaign buttons, they were supported. There was a case a few months ago where the kid with the Black Lives Matter t-shirt was punished, and somebody else with another political t-shirt was allowed to wear the shirt. That's arguably viewpoint discrimination. It's singling out a person for a specific viewpoint. But what the government often says is the government says, well, there is no right to free speech because this is government speech. If something is classified as government speech, there's no First Amendment right to challenge it. Let me try to explain. The state of Texas has a specially licensed plate program. Different groups can apply for specially licensed plates. The state of Texas applies, or the Sons of Confederate Veterans apply for a specially licensed plate. And their specially licensed plate depicts the Confederate flag. That's an offensive image to a lot of people, understandably. Is it a symbol of hate or a symbol of heritage? People disagree. But in a lot of states, they were allowed to have their specially licensed plates, but not in Texas. Texas said, this offends too many people, no right to this specially licensed plate. Goes all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court in 2015 in Walker versus Sons of Confederate Veterans by a 5-4 vote. The U.S. Supreme Court said specially licensed plates are a form of government speech. No First Amendment challenge. And you may say, well, I don't like the Confederate flag. I don't like it either, particularly the way it's used. But think about that. When we say that something is government speech, we're abolishing essentially all First Amendment challenges to that form of expression. That's troubling. The last threat to free speech I want to talk about is returning to that first principle. You know, the text of the First Amendment says, Congress shall make no law abridging freedom of speech. What that really means is no federal, state, or local government official can abridge speech. But what about Google? What about Facebook? What about any of these really super powerful private corporations that regularly censor or selectively support certain speakers? What I refer to as pervasive private censorship of speech. A private actor can censor speech a lot. Should we relax the so-called state action doctrine? Should the First Amendment be interpreted to limit their speech as well? Or should we just keep it at the government? It's a very interesting question. It's also what I refer to as one of the seminal free speech issues of modern time. I want to leave you with these thoughts. And I want to leave you with the idea about you have constitutional freedoms, you have individual rights, but if you never exercise them, and if you don't care about them, they can go away. Just as the government can grant rights, governments can take them away. And when you're not active, when you're not an active, informed citizenry, those rights can dissipate. And make no mistake about it, you are the future of the country. You may not see it right now, or again, I certainly didn't see it too well in high school, right? I was on the receiving end of lectures and on very, very rare occasions, punishments. But you are the future of the country. And I worry that you will not respect those constitutional freedoms if you don't live in an environment that respects them. Exercise your voice. Use your First Amendment free speech rights responsibly. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Very, very impressive. Thank you very much. I think we have time for a few questions, if there are any questions. If you have any questions, thought about that. Nobody? Yes.
Why don't we have any free speech rights in a private school?
Because of something called the state action doctrine. And the state action doctrine provides that the Bill of Rights only limits governmental actors.
Okay, so who's limiting our action?
Yes, state action. That was decided by the U.S. Supreme Court in 1883 in a collection of cases called the civil rights cases. And remember, the text of the First Amendment against Congress shall make no law, and that's been interpreted to mean no federal, state, or local government official. So at the private school level, I don't mean to say you have no rights, but your rights are contractually based. They're based on contract. They're not based on the Constitution. Great question. Yes, sir.
Is there a limit to the physical items you can use as symbolic for your speech? Like, is there some message too big or too small to be counted as speech?
There are limitations to the symbolic speech doctrine. Some of these cases I think are a bit odd. Like there was a case in Indiana that I wrote about recently where a guy just refused to cut his grass. And it got about like this tall. And his neighbors were kind of like, what's going on? This is a nuisance. Like this is lowering our property values. And he said that he was refusing to cut his grass as a form of protest against overzealous municipal officials who were telling him what to do. Guess what? He lost. Another case involved a public school student who did not like a provision in his school dress code that prohibited the wearing of sagging pants. He said, look, I want to wear sagging pants. It's an expression of support for hip-hop culture. And the court said, well, no, that's not protected speech. So there are limitations. It's a great question. Yes?
How does the law apply to, or does it apply to, tracking cookies? For instance, if you're very vocal on petitions or the little emails you get, agree or I don't agree, those kinds of things. Now that we know that almost everything that we do is being tracked online, does this...
Though that's a very interesting question, yes. And most of that is done by private companies, not the government. So your protections would be statutory, not constitutional, right? Again, the Constitution only limits the government. So if the government were monitoring you, or the government spied on you without cause, that would be a First Amendment or Fourth Amendment issue. If it's a private company, then we have to lobby our legislators to get them to pass consumer protection laws that provide us statutory privacy or law-based privacy. Yeah, but it wouldn't be I don't think it would be a constitutional issue unless there was active government involvement. Any other? Thank you.
David will be here for a while, and I represent this kid in the school.
Oh, thanks so much.
Very much, David.
Thank you.